Hey everyone, and welcome to Medieval Nocturnes. Tonight, we're venturing into a world a little closer to our own time, but no less rugged and misunderstood, the American Wild West. We're pushing past the swinging doors of the classic saloon, looking beyond the poker games and piano tunes to ask a simple question. What did cowboys actually eat in these places? Was it a hearty meal after a long day on the trail, or something you choked down just to survive? Before we dive in, if you enjoy exploring the quieter, more unusual corners of history, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us create more content just like this. Now, find a comfortable spot, settle in, and let's travel back to a time of dust, desperation, and dinner. The first thing you'd notice upon entering a typical Wild West saloon wasn't the music or the clinking of glasses, but the overwhelming smell. It was a thick, complex aroma that told a story all its own, a blend of stale beer soaked into the wooden floor, the sharp tang of unwashed bodies after weeks on the prairie, cheap cigar smoke, and the ever-present scent of horse and leather from the street outside. This wasn't a place you came to for a pleasant dining experience. It was a place you came to escape the elements, find a drink, and maybe, if you were lucky, get a hot meal. Somewhere in the back, usually hidden in a dimly lit corner, was the kitchen. This was rarely a dedicated room. More often, it was a simple hearth or a cast-iron stove, manned by a single, overworked cook who might have been a failed prospector or a drifter paying his way. Their tools were minimal: a single, massive skillet that never got properly washed, a bubbling stew pot that was never empty, and a ladle that had seen more fights than a town sheriff. This was the source of that faint, hopeful smell of food, a scent fighting to be noticed amidst the chaos. Forget private tables and polite service. Dining in a saloon was a chaotic, communal affair. You found a seat wherever one was open, which usually meant squeezing onto a rickety bench next to a silent cattle driver on one side and a boisterous gambler on the other. The main bar, sticky with spilled whiskey and littered with cards, often doubled as the primary dining area. You'd hunch over your plate, protecting it with your elbows, while the life of the saloon swirled around you unabated. There were no printed menus. The day's offerings were simple and usually shouted from across the room by the barkeep or cook. Stew or beans was the common refrain. Your order was a quick, gruff exchange. If you were a regular, you got your plate without a word. If you were a stranger, you'd get a long, hard stare, a silent assessment to see if you were more likely to cause trouble or pass out before you paid your bill. Service was not about hospitality, it was about transaction. The fundamental rule of saloon dining was survival. You ate what was available, not what you craved. The food was fuel, a simple caloric deposit to get you through another day. Complaining about the quality was a fool's errand that could earn you a swift exit. You learned to eat quickly, trust no one, and appreciate the accompanying glass of whiskey, which served the dual purpose of washing the meal down and killing any lingering bacteria you might have ingested along with it. If saloon cuisine had a king, it was the humble bean, not because it was delicious, but because it was indestructible. Beans were cheap to buy, easy to store for months on end, and required almost no culinary skill to prepare. They could endure long cattle drives, dusty storerooms, and even a cook who was half asleep. Pinto, navy, kidney, the type didn't matter. They were the dependable, ever-present foundation of almost every meal served. The preparation of saloon beans was less a recipe and more a ritual of endurance. A massive, soot-blackened pot was placed over a low fire, and it rarely left. The process was brutally simple. Dump in a sack of dried beans. Cover them with water from the nearest well or creek, and let them simmer for hours, sometimes days. The goal wasn't flavor. It was to boil the beans into a state of soft, edible submission, creating a thick, starchy porridge that could sustain a man through a hard day's work or a long night of losing at cards. Seasoning was an afterthought, a luxury few cooks could afford or be bothered with. The primary flavor came from a generous heap of salt, and, most importantly, a large chunk of salt pork tossed into the pot. This slab of cured meat would slowly render its fat and salt into the beans, giving them a greasy, savory character. On a truly rare occasion, a cook who had come across a supply train might add a dash of chili powder or a few wild onions, transforming the bland mush into something almost memorable. Beans were hearty and filling, the perfect fuel for a frontier economy built on manual labor. However, they came with a well-known side effect. A single cowboy enjoying a plate of beans was one thing. A cramped, poorly ventilated saloon filled with 24 men who had all dined on the same meal was another entirely. It's been said that more than a few bar fights were started not over a card game, but by an unfortunate and ill-timed release of gaseous pressure near the poker table. If beans were the soul of saloon food, then salt pork was its tough, greasy backbone. This was not the thin, crispy bacon we know today. Salt pork was a thick slab of pork belly, heavily cured in a mountain of salt and brine to preserve it for months without refrigeration. It was stored in barrels and transported across the country, arriving at saloons as a dense, formidable block of meat and fat that could survive heat, dust, and neglect. For many cowboys, it was the only form of meat they might see for weeks. Cooking salt pork was a battle of wills between the cook and the meat. The ideal method was to slice it thick and fry it in a cast iron skillet until it was rendered crispy and brown. The sizzling sound and the smell of frying pork fat would cut through the saloon's usual odor, a welcome sign that a hot meal was on its way. When done right, it was a salty, crunchy, and deeply satisfying treat that added a much-needed punch to a plate of bland beans. However, when cooked improperly, salt pork was notoriously difficult to eat. It could be tough as leather, and so salty it would make your teeth ache. A hurried or unskilled cook might serve up a piece that was chewy, greasy, and almost inedible, like gnawing on a salted candle. Furthermore, its freshness was always a gamble. A greenish tinge or a slightly off smell was often ignored under the saloon's unofficial motto. If the last man who ate it is still standing, it's safe enough. One of the most important qualities of salt pork was its versatility. No part of it was wasted. After frying, the leftover liquid fat, or lard, was carefully saved. This liquid gold was used to fry everything else, from potatoes to eggs to bread, infusing every dish with a savory, pork-flavored essence. The tough, inedible rind was often trimmed off and tossed directly into the perpetual stew pot, where it would simmer for days, slowly releasing its flavor and contributing to the saloon's most mysterious and enduring dish. In the Wild West, stew was the great culinary equalizer. It bubbled away in a pot in the corner of nearly every saloon, from the roughest mining camp tent to the more established town taverns. Stew was the perfect solution for a frontier cook because it was incredibly forgiving. It didn't require fresh ingredients, precise measurements, or much attention. It was a culinary canvas for scraps, leftovers, and whatever could be sourced cheaply, making it the most economical and reliable dish on any saloon's non-existent menu. The foundation of any saloon stew was simple: a pot, a fire, and a bit of ambition. A cook would start with a base of water, perhaps thickened with a handful of potatoes or leftover beans from the day before. This unassuming slurry was the starting point, a promise of a hot meal that would evolve throughout the day as new ingredients were acquired and tossed into the mix, creating a dish that was never the same twice. The true character of a saloon stew came from its protein, which was often a mystery best left unsolved. While chunks of beef were a welcome and rare luxury, the pot was more likely to contain whatever was most available. This could mean rabbit, squirrel, or even rattlesnake, if one had been dispatched near the premises. Cowboys learned not to ask questions. If the local cat population seemed to be dwindling, or the cook looked particularly shifty, you simply ate around the bits that were too chewy and took another sip of whiskey. If a stew was fortunate enough to contain vegetables, they were typically boiled for so long that they lost all semblance of their original form. Carrots would dissolve into soft orange smudges within the broth. Onions would melt away entirely, leaving behind only their faint flavor. The humble potato was the most resilient, holding its shape longer than the others. But it too would eventually surrender, becoming a soft, starchy component of the thick, bubbling liquid. The final product was a hearty, if unappetizing-looking concoction. It was usually a thick, brown-gray slurry that bubbled menacingly in the pot. Despite its appearance, the long simmering of meat, fat, and root vegetables often produced a rich, savory aroma that was far more appealing than the stew itself looked. For a man who hadn't eaten a hot meal in days, that smell was an irresistible invitation. No bowl of stew or plate of beans was complete without something to soak it all up with. Saloon bread generally came in two starkly different forms. The first, a rare and treasured find, was the soft, flaky biscuit. When a cook knew how to make them right, they were a piece of heaven, warm, buttery, and perfect for mopping up every last drop of gravy. Cooks who mastered the art of the biscuit were whispered about with a reverence usually reserved for legendary gunslingers. More often than not, however, what you got was hardtack. This was less a bread and more a baked slab of flour and water, cooked until it achieved a density that could likely stop a bullet. Originally created for long sea voyages and military campaigns, hardtack found a new home on the frontier for one simple reason: it never went bad. It also barely qualified as food, and eating it was a strategic challenge that usually involved a lengthy soaking in coffee, whiskey, or the stew itself to render it chewable. If you believe modern coffee is strong, you've never tried cowboy coffee. This was a brew so potent it didn't just wake you up, it felt like it could stare back at you from the cup. In the Wild West, coffee was a matter of survival, not taste. It wasn't selected for its origin notes, passed through delicate paper filters, or adorned with artistic foam. It was a gritty, powerful fuel, made with brute force and consumed out of necessity. The process was simple and aggressive, a reflection of the land itself. The standard recipe for cowboy coffee began with whatever water was on hand, hopefully from a source upstream of where the horses drank. A generous handful of coffee grounds, measured by instinct rather than a scoop, was thrown directly into a kettle or tin pot. There was no concept of a bloom or a pour-over. The pot was placed directly on the embers of a fire and boiled hard until the liquid turned a deep, menacing black and took on a life of its own. The resulting brew was a thick, dark concoction with an aroma of burnt toast and pure determination. It was never strained. Cowboys believed the grounds gave it character, and the final sip from a tin cup was often more solid than liquid, a combination of caffeine and fiber that was as practical as it was punishing. This was a drink that tested your resolve with every gulp, and yet it was beloved. Coffee was a source of immense comfort on the desolate frontier. It provided warmth on freezing desert mornings before a cattle drive, and kept a lone rider awake during a long night watch under the stars. It was a reliable remedy for the throbbing headache of a whiskey hangover and a digestive aid for a stomach wrestling with a questionable meal of mystery stew. It was fuel, medicine, and a small moment of ritual in a chaotic life. Saloons didn't always serve coffee, as many lacked a proper kitchen, but those that did served it the only way they knew how: boiling hot, unapologetically strong, and likely brewed hours earlier. The pot would sit on the stove all day, growing thicker and more potent with each passing hour. A fancy establishment might offer a spoonful of sugar or a splash of canned milk, a rare luxury that could soften its aggressive edge. Most drinkers, however, took it straight, grimacing as they powered through the bitter, tar-like liquid. Some saloon cooks, ever economical, would even reuse the old grounds for days, simply adding a bit of fresh coffee on top to stretch the supply. This resulted in a brew that tasted of little more than disappointment and regret. But it was hot, wet, and caffeinated, and on the frontier, that was often enough. You didn't drink cowboy coffee for pleasure. You drank it to feel alive, to sharpen your senses, and to arm yourself against the harsh realities of the day. It was a kick from a mule in liquid form, a jolt to the system that was as brutal as it was necessary. In the rugged world of the Wild West, meat was more than just a meal. It was a statement. It represented status, wealth, and a temporary victory over the harshness of the frontier. To be able to walk into a dusty saloon, slap a coin on the bar, and order a steak was to announce to everyone present that you were a person of means. It was a luxury that most cowboys, who often lived on beans and biscuits for weeks, could only dream of. However, the dream of a saloon steak was often far better than the reality. What arrived on your plate was rarely a tender, perfectly cooked cut of beef. More often, it was a tough, sinewy slab that had been brutally fried in a pan of hot lard until it was scorched into submission. There was no concept of medium rare. You got it well done, or you got it more well done. Any request for a hint of pink in the middle would be met with a long, silent stare from the cook that made you question your life choices. Fresh beef was surprisingly scarce, even in the heart of cattle country. Preserving meat without refrigeration was a constant struggle, and much of the beef from cattle drives was destined for markets back east. This scarcity forced saloon cooks to become incredibly resourceful, turning to a wide array of alternative protein sources to keep their hungry patrons fed. When the beef ran out, the menu turned to whatever the wilderness would provide. This often meant dried meat, like tough, salty jerky made from buffalo or beef, which could last for months. If a local hunter had a successful day, the saloon might offer venison from a deer, or even meat from a wild boar. These gamey, flavorful meats were a welcome change from the usual fare, offering a true taste of the wild landscape. They were a reminder that the frontier was still a place of abundance. if you knew where to look. In more isolated areas, like remote mining camps, the definition of meat stretched even further. With supply lines thin, cooks used anything that could be caught. Squirrels and jackrabbits were common additions to the perpetual stew pot, and some of the more adventurous establishments were known to serve roasted rattlesnake. The unwritten rule was simple. If it moved and didn't belong to a customer, it was a potential dinner. Sometimes, a plate of meat would be served with no name at all. This was a silent agreement between the cook and the customer. You ate what was in front of you, and you did not ask about its origins. If you found a piece that was unusually chewy, or discovered something that looked suspiciously like a whisker, you took a long drink of your whiskey, nodded to yourself, and carried on. Ignorance wasn't just bliss, it was a key ingredient. On the rare occasion that all the stars aligned, when the beef was fresh, the cook was sober, and the fire was hot, you might get a truly magnificent meal. A thick, sizzling steak, perhaps topped with a fried egg, and served with a warm biscuit on the side. It was a plate of food that could make you forget the dust, the danger, and the loneliness of the trail. It was a brief moment of civilization and a powerful reminder of what you were fighting to survive for. In a typical Wild West saloon, the concept of dessert was more of a happy accident than a planned part of the meal. After a dinner of questionable stew and rock-hard bread, sweetness was a rare and precious commodity. There were no pastry chefs or detailed dessert menus. Instead, if a cook had a surplus of simple ingredients and a moment of inspiration, they might produce the one reliable, sweet comfort of the frontier. Cornbread. Cornbread was the ultimate multi-purpose food, made from a simple, cheap mixture of cornmeal, water or milk, and a spoonful of lard. It could be baked, fried, or even dropped in clumps into a pot of stew. It served as a side dish, a main course, or, with a bit of help, a dessert. Its slightly sweet, grainy texture was a welcome change from the usual savory and salty flavors of the saloon kitchen. Of course, the quality varied wildly. Fresh out of a hot skillet, cornbread could be a delight, warm, crumbly, with a satisfyingly crisp crust. More often than not, however, the piece you were served had been sitting near the stove since dawn. This left it dry, dense, and hardened, with all the appeal of a yellow brick. Eating it on its own was a chore that required a strong jaw and a lot of patience. But even the driest cornbread could be saved by a single magical ingredient: molasses. This dark, sticky syrup was the frontier's secret weapon against bad baking. Kept in a large barrel in the corner of the kitchen, this thick, bittersweet liquid was drizzled over a wedge of stale cornbread, instantly transforming it from a trial into a treat. The molasses would soak into the dense grain, softening it and imparting a deep, rich sweetness. For a weary cowboy or a homesick miner, this simple combination was the height of luxury. It was the cowboy's frosting, the gambler's last bit of comfort before heading back to the poker table. In a diet that consisted mainly of salt, grease, and bland starches, the pure, uncomplicated sugar rush of molasses was a profound joy. It was a taste that reminded them of a simpler time, a brief, sweet escape from the bitterness of their daily lives. Some saloons offered what was considered a fancy version. The cook might fry the cornbread in a skillet with a bit of lard until it was golden brown and sizzling, before pouring warm molasses over the top. It wasn't quite a cake, and it certainly wasn't a pie, but if you'd spent the last month eating nothing but jerky on the trail, it felt like the most decadent dessert imaginable. Ultimately, Cornbread with molasses was more than just a way to end a meal. It was a small but significant reminder that not everything on the frontier was harsh and unforgiving. It proved that even in the dustiest, roughest corners of the West, a little bit of sweetness could still be found. It was a simple, gooey, and satisfying plate of hope. We hope you're enjoying this look into the food of the Old West. If you appreciate these deep dives into the forgotten corners of history, please take a moment to subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes. It truly helps us continue our explorations. If you were fortunate enough to walk into a saloon before noon, ideally with a clear head and no fresh injuries, you might have been offered a true frontier luxury: eggs and chicken. Seeing these items available was nothing short of a miracle. It signaled that you had found a superior establishment, one that had access to food that was both fresh and fragile, a rarity in a world built on durable, non-perishable staples. Fresh eggs in the Wild West were like edible gold. They were incredibly rare and difficult to come by. Chickens were high-maintenance creatures in a low-maintenance world. They were prone to wandering off, falling prey to foxes and coyotes, or simply being stolen by a hungry neighbor. A saloon that could offer eggs either had its own carefully guarded flock, a dependable connection to a nearby farm, or was part of a secret supply chain from a more civilized town. The type and quality of the eggs were, naturally, a gamble. You hoped for chicken eggs, but you might be served duck or even turkey eggs without any announcement. A wise customer never asked. The cook's preparation methods were often designed to disguise an egg's age. They might be scrambled aggressively to hide any discoloration, or fried in hot lard until the yolks were cooked into solid, leathery pucks. A wobbly, undercooked egg was a sign from the universe to stick to whiskey. As for the chicken, the promise of a fried chicken dinner was often more exciting than the meal itself. The bird you were served was rarely the plump, juicy specimen we imagine today. It was more likely a scrawny, tough creature that died angry, fried in lard until it was dry and bony. The meat was often sparse and required serious effort to chew. You might get a drumstick the size of your thumb, or a wing that was more bone than meat. And yet, people ate it with gratitude. A plate of chicken, no matter how tough, was a welcome break from the relentless monotony of beans and salt pork. It was a different flavor, a different texture, and a reminder of the kind of meal one might have eaten back home. For that reason alone, it was worth the effort. It was hot, it was meat, and most importantly, it wasn't stew. For a saloon, offering eggs and chicken for breakfast was a powerful status symbol. It was a way of boasting to the entire town about its success and stability. It announced, "We have access to food that requires daily care, food that didn't arrive in a barrel or a sack." It was a sign of prosperity, a subtle declaration that this establishment was a pillar of the community, not just a temporary watering hole. Ultimately, ordering a plate of eggs was an act of hope. It represented the start of a new day, a belief in survival, and the simple, optimistic notion that you would live to see the sun set once more. It was a warm, protein-filled foundation for whatever challenges the day might bring. A small taste of civilization before heading back out into the wild. In a Wild West saloon, pie was not just a dessert. It was a declaration. If you walked through the swinging doors and saw a whole pie resting on the bar, its crust golden brown, a wisp of steam curling up from a vent in the top, you knew you had entered an establishment that meant business. The presence of a pie meant that someone in the kitchen possessed skill, had access to precious ingredients, and had invested real time and effort, a combination that was practically a love letter in a land of instant beans and questionable stew. Now, it's important to manage expectations. This was not the kind of perfect, lattice-topped pie you might see at a county fair. Frontier pie was a rough, rustic creation. The crust was often uneven. The fillings were made from whatever fruit could be preserved, usually canned apples, dried peaches, or a generic berry mix, and it was almost always served lukewarm on a tin plate. Luxuries like whipped cream were the stuff of fantasy unless a cow happened to wander into the saloon with you. The most common varieties were apple and peach, as those fruits held up well to canning and drying. A berry pie was a more flexible category, sometimes featuring actual berries, but just as often filled with raisins or other mysterious dried fruits that had been rehydrated into a sweet, jammy filling. If the cook was feeling particularly generous, they might add a dash of cinnamon or nutmeg. But more often than not, the pie's flavor profile was a simple combination of fruit, sugar, and optimism. Still, pie was a rare and coveted treat, and saloon owners knew it. Offering a decent slice of pie was a powerful business advantage. Word of a good apple pie could travel for miles, pulling in dusty travelers and local cowboys who might otherwise have spent their money at a rival establishment. In a world with no advertising, a warm, flaky pie was the best marketing tool a saloon could have. This rarity made pie a potential source of serious conflict. Legends and letters from the era tell tales of poker games ending in drawn pistols, not because of cheating, but because one man took the last slice of pie, in a place where a spilled whiskey could lead to a brawl. Denying a man a piece of a dessert he hadn't tasted in years was a grave offense. Pie was, in its own way, sacred ground. Of course, not all pies lived up to the hype. Some were all crust and no filling, a disappointing waste of a coin. Others had fillings that were so cloyingly sweet they made your teeth hurt, or fillings that hinted at having been fruit once in a previous life. But when the stars aligned, when the cook was sober, the oven was hot, and the fruit was just right, that pie was an event to be remembered for weeks. For the cowboy who spent his days subsisting on hardtack and jerky, that perfect slice of pie was a moment of pure bliss. It was a taste of home, a reminder of civilization, and a reward for enduring the hardships of the trail. It wasn't just food, it was comfort, served warm and sweet on a tin plate. It was a small, edible piece of hope. Finding cheese in a Wild West saloon was a lot like joining a high-stakes poker game. It was a gamble, required a bit of bravery, and there was a decent chance you'd leave with a bad taste in your mouth. Cheese did exist on the frontier, but it was a rare and unpredictable commodity. You had to know where to find it, and even then, you had to be willing to take a risk. Because frontier cheese had a personality all its own. This wasn't cheese that arrived in tidy, wax-wrapped wheels from a distant factory. It was almost always produced locally, often by a farmer or rancher's wife who had learned the art of cheese-making from a passed-down family recipe or a vague memory. With no pasteurization and no climate control, the results were wildly inconsistent. The lack of refrigeration was the biggest challenge. Any cheese had to be hardy enough to survive the elements, or at least be eaten before it started to crawl away. Saloon cheese generally came in one of two forms. The first was a hard, yellow block, often with a slightly greasy sheen from sweating in the heat. The second was a soft, crumbly white cheese, which tended to have a sharp, aggressive tang that could take you by surprise. You might be told it was cheddar or something resembling Swiss, but in reality, it was often just a unique creation of dairy, salt, and hope. It was typically served in simple, unadorned chunks. You might get a slice alongside a piece of dried jerky or a hardtack biscuit, where its sharp flavor could help cut through the salt and blandness of everything else. In a more upscale establishment, it might even come with a pickle. It was a quick and easy source of protein and fat, perfect for a man who needed a boost of energy between glasses of whiskey. But you had to be careful. Some less than scrupulous saloon keepers might try to pass off old, rancid butter or pressed milk curds as cheese, often rolling the concoction in black pepper to mask the questionable flavor. One traveler famously wrote of buying a piece of cheese in Nevada that tasted like a boiled sock, but he ate the entire thing anyway. On the frontier, even bad cheese was still cheese, a rare departure from the usual fare. Ultimately, a saloon that offered cheese was making a statement. It was a flex. It signaled that the owner had a connection to a local farm with a dairy cow, a cow that, crucially, hadn't been rustled yet. Offering cheese was a way of showing off a level of stability and access to fresh goods that most other establishments lacked. It was a symbol of being a cut above the rest. So, if a slice of cheese appeared on your plate, you'd treat it with cautious respect. You'd inspect it, maybe give it a tentative sniff, and then, because you were a gambler at heart, you'd eat it anyway. Because, in the heart of the dusty, untamed West, a chunk of cheese wasn't just food. It was a small, tangible link to civilization, a taste of a tamer world, even if it was a little sweaty. If an item could be soaked in vinegar and left in a jar for 6 months, you could probably find it in a Wild West saloon. Pickling wasn't a culinary trend. It was a desperate, brilliant survival strategy. Before refrigeration, the sharp, acidic power of brine was one of the only reliable ways to keep food from rotting. Vegetables, eggs, and sometimes even fruit were submerged in this sour bath. Their shelf life extended from days to months or even years. The most common and least offensive of these offerings was the pickled cucumber. The classic pickle was a familiar sight, sitting in a large crock on the bar. It was sharp, crunchy, and intensely salty, the perfect thing to cut through the grease of a fried meal or to serve as a chaser after a particularly rough shot of whiskey. A good, crisp pickle was a simple pleasure, but a limp, soggy one was a common disappointment. Floating in cloudy jars nearby, you'd find one of the most iconic and divisive saloon snacks, the pickled egg. These ghostly, pale orbs, suspended in a murky brine, were a source of constant debate. To some cowboys, they were a perfect food, a quick, self-contained shot of protein that was easy to store and eat. To others, they were unappetizing oddities, with the texture of a rubber ball and the faint taste of regret. The pickling didn't stop there. In many saloons, especially those in mining towns, you could find jars of pickled onions. These were intensely sharp and tangy, with a potent flavor that could clear your sinuses and ward off unwanted conversation with a single bite. One was enough to give your breath the power to stop a stampede in its tracks. Occasionally, cooks would experiment with sweeter things. Pickled peaches or pears might make an appearance. Their natural sweetness creating a strange but addictive sweet and sour flavor profile. It wasn't quite a dessert, and it wasn't a side dish. It was a confusing, vinegary experiment that many were still willing to try if only for the novelty. The true beauty of these pickled goods was their incredible longevity. A saloon owner could stock up on jars and not have to worry about spoilage for an entire season. When fresh supplies were cut off by snow or flooding, and the meat had long since gone bad, the pickled items remained. They were the reliable, unchanging foundation of the saloon's emergency food supply. But like everything else in a saloon, eating from the pickling jar came with a risk. Sometimes the brine was off, or the jar wasn't sealed properly. There were hushed tales of men biting into a pickled sausage only to discover it contained unidentifiable bones, or a strange, stringy texture that was definitely not pork. You ate them because they probably wouldn't kill you, and on the frontier, that was often the best guarantee you could hope for. It seems that even in the Old West, some things never change. People will pickle just about anything. We hope you're enjoying this historical menu. If so, and you haven't yet, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes for more journeys into the past. When the food was scarce, the kitchen was closed, or the stew in the pot looked like it might still have a pulse, cowboys and drifters turned to the most reliable item on any saloon's menu: whiskey. It was always available, required no cooking, and if you drank enough of it, you could forget that you were hungry in the first place. On many nights, dinner was served in a shot glass. This was not the smooth, barrel-aged whiskey of modern times. Frontier whiskey was a raw, fiery, and often dangerous spirit, distilled from corn, rye, or whatever grain the barkeep could get his hands on. It was often made in back rooms or hidden stills with little concern for purity or taste. It earned nicknames like rotgut, tarantula juice, and chain lightning, all of which aptly described the brutal experience of drinking it. When the beans were burnt and the hardtack was gone, men would drink their calories. A few shots of whiskey could provide a temporary feeling of warmth and fullness, staving off hunger pangs and providing the energy to face another cold night. It was a liquid meal, a desperate solution for desperate times, consumed not for pleasure, but for pure function. Whiskey was also the ultimate frontier multi-tool. It was used to numb the pain of a broken bone or a gunshot wound, to dull the heartache of a letter from home, and to fortify one's nerves before a high-stakes card game. It was a social lubricant that could forge a friendship with a shared bottle, or ignite a fistfight with a careless word. It was the anesthetic for the body and the soul. Some saloons offered whiskey specials, which typically included a shot of whiskey alongside a single, lonely food item, like a biscuit or a pickled egg. This wasn't a pairing for flavor. It was a practical measure to slow the alcohol's absorption and keep the customer upright at the bar for a little longer. The strange combination of a floating egg in a glass of liquor was considered both hydration and protein, a bizarre but functional meal. The quality of the whiskey was never guaranteed and often suspect. Unscrupulous barkeeps were known to stretch their supply by adding water, or to give it a more powerful kick by mixing in anything from tobacco juice to cayenne pepper. The intense burn as it went down was considered a mark of authenticity. If your whiskey didn't feel like it was trying to fight its way back up, you were probably drinking something disappointingly weak. Yet, despite its often terrible quality, whiskey was the most honest thing in the saloon. It never pretended to be anything other than what it was, a raw, powerful force in a glass. It didn't hide its flaws behind gravy or spices. On those nights when your only meal was the warm glow spreading through your chest, You raised your glass to its brutal honesty and, with no judgment, called it dinner. In every Wild West saloon that served food, there existed a shadowy figure whose power was absolute. The cook, often found shrouded in smoke and steam in a dark corner of the establishment. This individual held a unique and fearsome authority. They were rarely seen smiling and often smelled of grease and wood smoke, but their influence over the daily lives of the saloon's patrons was immense. They could be a culinary genius who saved you from starvation, or a culinary war criminal who made you wish you'd starved. There was rarely a middle ground. These were not professionally trained chefs. Saloon cooks were typically men who had drifted into the job from other tough professions. They were ex-miners with bad lungs, ex-soldiers with old wounds, or ex-cons trying to keep a low profile. What they all had in common was a knowledge of how to build a fire and a complete lack of fear when it came to handling questionable ingredients. Their irritable demeanor was a shield, forged in the heat of their makeshift kitchens. The cook's domain was not a kitchen in the modern sense. It was a small, fiercely defended territory. It consisted of a fire pit or a dented stove, a chopping block, and one or two massive cast-iron pans that seemed to hold the memory of every meal ever cooked in them. This was their kingdom, and they ruled it with an iron ladle. Woe to the drunkard who stumbled into their space uninvited. The food they produced was a direct reflection of their mood. On a good day, the biscuits would be light and fluffy, the beans perfectly tender, and the stew might even contain identifiable chunks of decent meat. But on a bad day, if the wood was wet or the whiskey ran out, the food would be a scorched, greasy plate of misery. The fate of your dinner rested entirely on the cook's disposition. This led to the most important and unspoken rule of saloon etiquette. You never, ever insulted the cook. To do so was to risk more than just a dirty look. The cook had total control over the food. If they liked you, you might get an extra piece of salt pork. If you crossed them, you could expect the burnt scrapings from the bottom of the pot, served with a look that promised worse to come. In many ways, the cook also served as the saloon's unofficial bouncer. While the bartender might break up a fight, a single, menacing glare from the cook was often enough to silence an entire room. No one was eager to argue with a large, irritable man holding a heavy, grease-covered skillet, or, in some cases, a very large meat cleaver. Their presence alone kept a certain kind of peace, despite their gruff exteriors and the often predictable quality of their meals. These cooks were the unsung heroes of the frontier. They worked tirelessly in sweltering heat, feeding dozens of hungry men on a meager budget. They kept cowboys fueled for long rides and gave miners the strength to head back into the dark tunnels day after day. They were the engine of the saloon. So, whether they served you a plate of life-saving comfort or a bowl of gastrointestinal revenge, you always gave them a nod of respect. In a world of chaos and uncertainty, the saloon cook was a formidable and vital force, holding the fate of your stomach in their greasy, calloused, and capable hands. Now that we've journeyed through the swinging doors, breathed in the thick, smoky air, and surveyed the full menu from the perpetual stew to the infamous pickled egg, the real question remains: would you actually eat it? Confronted with a plate of anonymous meat, a wedge of hardened cornbread, and a side of beans that have been simmering for 3 days, it's a fair question to ask. For the modern palate, accustomed to sanitation, variety, and flavor, the experience would likely be a profound shock. The overwhelming saltiness of the pork, the blandness of the beans, the suspicious texture of the stew, and the ever-present layer of grease on everything would be a challenge for even the most adventurous eater. It was food born of pure necessity, with taste and presentation being distant, almost irrelevant afterthoughts. But to truly understand saloon food, we have to see it through the eyes of a person from that time. For the cowboy who had just spent 10 days on a cattle drive, with nothing but trail dust in his lungs and jerky in his saddlebag, a saloon meal was a godsend. For the miner emerging from the darkness of the earth, caked in dirt and sweat, a hot plate of anything was a taste of life itself. It wasn't about gourmet quality. It was about calories, warmth, and fuel. This was the core principle of frontier dining. Survival always trumped flavor. You didn't complain that the biscuit was dry because it was bread. You didn't ask what kind of animal was in the stew because it was meat. You ate what was put in front of you because the alternative was often an empty stomach and another cold, hungry night. A hot meal was a shield against the relentless hardship of the West. So, would you eat it? If you were living back then? The answer is an unequivocal yes. You would not only eat it, you would be deeply grateful for it. You would scrape your bowl clean with a crust of bread, wash it all down with a shot of fiery whiskey, and maybe even nod your thanks to the surly cook in the corner. You would share a table with strangers, laugh at a bad joke, and feel, for a moment, like part of a community. And on those rare, miraculous days when the food was genuinely good, when the beans were perfectly seasoned, the coffee didn't bite back, and the cook had spared a bit of molasses for the cornbread, it felt like a feast. It was a moment of profound comfort and satisfaction, a small victory that made the struggle worthwhile. Saloon food was never meant to be glamorous. It was gritty, it was greasy, and it was unapologetically real. It was the perfect culinary reflection of the Wild West itself, tough, straightforward, and designed not for delicate sensibilities, but for survival. And in a world where survival was a daily struggle, that was more than enough. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the saloons of the Old West. If you enjoy these explorations of history's forgotten details, we hope you'll subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes and join us for our next story. Long before tattoos were inked in sterile shops with electric needles, they existed in a much older, more mysterious world. They were etched into skin not for fashion, but for protection, for healing, and for survival. We will now journey back to a time before written history, when gods were still unnamed and humanity lived intimately with the forces of nature, to uncover the ancient roots of marking the human body. Our story begins not in a city, but frozen in a glacier. In 1991, hikers in the Eastal Alps, on the border of Austria and Italy, discovered the mummified body of a man who had been preserved in the ice for over 5,300 years, known today as See the Iceman. He is older than the Great Pyramids and Stonehenge, a perfect time capsule from the Copper Age, and across his leathery skin, scientists found something astonishingly familiar: tattoos. Sisi's body is adorned with 61 individual tattoos, but these are not the elaborate designs we might imagine. They are simple, dark marks, a series of parallel lines and small crosses, made from fine charcoal dust, rubbed into tiny cuts in his skin. They run down his lower spine, appear behind his knees, and circle his ankles. They are not art for an audience. They seem to be marks made for a purpose. And this is where the story gets truly fascinating. When researchers mapped the locations of Sisi's tattoos, They discovered that they corresponded with areas of significant joint and spinal degeneration in his skeleton. Many of these points are the very same locations used in modern acupuncture to treat ailments like arthritis. This suggests that his tattoos may have been a form of prehistoric therapeutic medicine, a way to manage chronic pain. Was this an ancient form of pain relief, a shamanic healing ritual, or something more? Perhaps the act of being tattooed was a rite of endurance, the pain a necessary part of the cure. We will likely never know for certain, but what TSI proves is that for thousands of years, humans have been intentionally marking their skin with a deeper purpose in mind. And he wasn't alone. In the warmer climate of ancient Egypt, tattoos appeared most often on women, particularly priestesses, dancers, and royal concubines. These were not random decorations, but symbolic patterns of dots and dashes, often placed on the abdomen, thighs, and breasts. Many scholars believe these markings were intended to act as a form of spiritual protection, safeguarding a woman during the perils of pregnancy and childbirth. Further south, in ancient Nubia, archaeologists have unearthed mummies bearing tattoos of powerful animals, a bull on one arm, a crocodile on another. These were not mere pictures, but symbols of strength, ferocity, and survival, permanently etched into the skin. Like a form of spiritual armor, these marks were meant to bestow the power of the animal onto the wearer. From the frozen peaks of the Alps to the sun-scorched sands of Africa, these early societies show us that tattoos were not acts of rebellion or vanity. They were rituals of reverence, resilience, and identity. They were a way to heal the body, protect the soul, and write a story directly onto the human canvas. If you believe tattoos are merely a form of edgy self-expression, try sharing that thought in a Polynesian community where the practice is woven into the very fabric of identity and spirit. In these cultures, tattoos were never optional or decorative. They were sacred. In fact, the word tattoo itself is a gift from this region, derived from the Tahitian word tatau, which means to strike. This name perfectly captures the rhythmic, percussive method at the heart of the tradition. The process was a sacred ritual, far removed from the buzz of a modern tattoo gun. A master artist or tufuga would use a set of handmade tools, a small, serrated comb carved from bone or boar tusk, and a wooden mallet. The comb would be dipped in ink made from burnt candlenut soot, placed against the skin, and then rhythmically tapped with the mallet, driving the pigment into the flesh with each deliberate strike. It was a painful, meditative process, often accompanied by chants and prayers. In societies like Samoa, Tonga, and particularly among the Ambori of New Zealand, tattoos were more than art. They were a language. A person's moko, the intricate facial tattoos of the Ambori, was a living document. The swirling lines and complex patterns across the face could tell you everything about the wearer. Their genealogy, their tribal affiliations, their social standing, and their personal history of achievements. To be without a moko was, in a sense, to be a blank page, a person without a story. Receiving one's first tattoos was a grueling rite of passage, a pivotal step from adolescence into adulthood. This was not a casual decision. It was a spiritual transformation that required immense courage and endurance. There were no anesthetics to dull the excruciating pain. There was only the support of one's family and the deep cultural belief in the purpose behind the suffering. To endure the ordeal was to prove one's worthiness and strength. Women, too, were integral to this tradition. They often wore tattoos on their chins, lips, or thighs. These marks were symbols of beauty, fertility, and maturity. They signified a woman's connection to Mana, the sacred life force and spiritual power that Polynesians believe flows through all people and things. A woman adorned with these sacred marks was seen as complete, her story and status permanently etched for all to see. But this ancient tradition faced a grave threat with the arrival of European colonialism. Christian missionaries, viewing the practice through their own cultural lens, condemned tattooing as a pagan and barbaric custom. They associated it with savagery and sin, and in many parts of Polynesia, they successfully outlawed the practice. The sacred art of tattoo was forced into the shadows, a language spoken only in whispers. Yet, the ink never truly faded. In recent decades, there has been a powerful resurgence of traditional tattooing across the Pacific Islands. A new generation is proudly reclaiming their heritage, reviving the ancient designs and techniques. The rhythmic sound of bone tapping against skin is being heard once more, not just as an art form, but as a powerful act of cultural survival. These marks are not just on the skin, they are declarations of blood, spirit, and belonging. As we leave the sun-soaked islands of the Pacific, our journey takes us to the world of philosophers, emperors, and marble statues. When we think of ancient Greece and Rome, we imagine pristine, idealized bodies carved from stone, the very picture of perfection. But if you peel back this veneer of myth, you'll find that ink existed here too, not as a mark of honor, but as a tool lurking in the shadows of society. In ancient Greece, tattoos were primarily associated with the underclass, slaves, criminals, and foreign captives. In fact, our modern word stigma comes directly from the Greek word for these marks. A stigma was a permanent brand or tattoo inked into the skin as a form of punishment and social control. It was not a symbol of identity chosen by the wearer, but a label forced upon them by those in power. These were not intricate or symbolic designs. They were blunt, public warnings. A runaway slave might be captured and have his forehead tattooed with words that translated to, "Stop me, I am a runaway." It was a permanent scarlet letter, an inescapable mark of shame that announced a person's disgrace to everyone they met. It was a way to make a person's body a prison from which they could never escape. The Romans, ever pragmatic and efficient, saw the utility in this practice and adopted it for their own purposes. Soldiers in the Roman army, especially those serving in distant and specialized legions, were often tattooed with the insignia of their unit. This was not a badge of honor, but a practical measure. A flesh-bound dog tag to discourage desertion and to help identify the dead on the battlefield. But the Romans also used tattoos as a brand of ownership. Gladiators, slaves, and prisoners of war were marked to signify that they were property. This was a brutal but effective tool of dehumanization, reducing a person to the status of livestock. The ink on their skin was a constant reminder, both to them and to others, that their lives were not their own. In a strange and powerful twist of history, the very people who were persecuted with these marks would eventually reclaim them. Early Christians were sometimes tattooed by Roman authorities as a form of public humiliation. Centuries later, however, Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land would voluntarily seek out tattoos, often having small crosses inked onto their arms as a permanent testament to their faith and their arduous journey. What began as a tool of oppression was transformed into a symbol of devotion. Later, the Roman Emperor Constantine, the first to embrace Christianity, would ban the practice of tattooing on the face. His reasoning was not driven by compassion for the tattooed, but by religious doctrine. The face, he declared, was made in God's image and should therefore not be defiled. The rest of the body, however, was still considered fair game for marking. Unlike in Polynesia, where tattoos could elevate a person to the level of royalty, in the Greco-Roman world, they did the opposite. They marked you as an outsider, a criminal, a slave. They were tools of punishment, ownership, and power, telling a story not of pride, but of subjugation. While the West was busy branding its slaves and criminals, the story of ink in the East took a more complex and paradoxical path. Here, tattoos could be a form of sacred protection, a mark of deep spiritual devotion, or a symbol of social exile. It was a world where the meaning of a tattoo depended entirely on who was wearing it and why. Our journey begins in India. While the subcontinent is more famous for the beautiful, temporary henna art known as Mendi, many of its tribal communities have a long and rich history of permanent tattooing. Among groups like the Bega and the Santhal, tattoos were considered both beautiful ornaments and powerful spiritual shields, particularly for women. The intricate geometric patterns on their skin were not applied on a whim, but as part of a deeply rooted tradition passed from mother to daughter. These marks were seen as a form of permanent jewelry, a treasure for the soul that no thief could ever steal and no poverty could ever take away. They were symbols of strength, fertility, and religious piety, believed to offer protection in both this life and the next. For these communities, a tattoo was not a scar upon the body, but an enhancement of its spiritual worth. Meanwhile, in Japan, the relationship with ink was far more complicated. In the country's ancient past, tattoos may have held a spiritual or status-marking role, much like in other early societies. But as Japan entered its feudal period, particularly during the long peace of the Edo era, the practice took on a much darker purpose. It became a formal tool of the state for punishment. Criminals were tattooed on their arms or faces with symbols that permanently branded them as outcasts. The marks would indicate the crime they had committed and the region in which they were sentenced, ensuring that they could never escape their past. To walk into a village was to have everyone instantly read your sins on your skin. It was a life sentence of social isolation. But then, something remarkable happened. In defiance of this system, a counterculture emerged. Groups living on the fringes of society, like heroic firemen, rugged laborers, and later, members of the criminal underworld known as the Yakuza, began to adopt tattoos, not as a mark of shame, but as a badge of honor. They embraced what society had deemed ugly and turned it into a symbol of their resilience and loyalty. They developed the breathtaking art of irizumi, or full-body tattooing. These were not small symbols, but massive, elaborate masterpieces depicting dragons, tigers, koi fish, and mythological heroes, often covering the body from the neck to the ankles. Created over hundreds of agonizing hours, these tattoos were a hidden identity, a personal legend, worn beneath a kimono or a suit, visible only to the initiated. The story of tattoos in the East is one of profound contradiction. They could be a prayer or a punishment, a mark of the sacred or the profane. It all depended on the context. But in all cases, the skin was never silent. It always told a story of power, piety, or pride. We hope you are finding this history as fascinating as we do. If you are enjoying the journey, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes for more stories from the forgotten corners of our world. As the Roman Empire crumbled and the foundations of medieval Europe were laid, the story of the tattoo takes a sharp turn. With the rise of Christianity as the dominant force across the continent, the tattoo needle, once a tool of Roman punishment, began to disappear almost entirely. The ink that had marked bodies for millennia faded into the shadows, suppressed by a new and powerful ideology. The reason for this decline was rooted in a fundamental shift in how the human body was perceived. In the eyes of the early church, the body was no longer just flesh and bone. It was a sacred vessel, a temple for the Holy Spirit. To intentionally mark or alter this temple was seen as an act of defilement, a violation of God's creation. This belief was reinforced by a specific passage in the Old Testament. The book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 28, explicitly states, "You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks upon you. I am the Lord." For centuries, this single line was interpreted as a divine prohibition against tattooing, providing religious authorities with the ultimate justification to condemn the practice. As a result, tattoos became inextricably linked with paganism. The pre-Christian tribes of Europe, such as the Celts and the Picts, had their own rich traditions of body marking. As the Church worked to convert these populations, it sought to erase their old customs. Tattoos were reframed as symbols of heathenism, witchcraft, and devil worship. In the fervent and often paranoid atmosphere of medieval Europe, being marked with a tattoo could be a dangerous, even fatal, liability. Under this immense religious and social pressure, the art of tattooing virtually vanished from the continent. It became a lost practice, relegated to the realm of folklore and superstition. For hundreds of years, the skin of medieval Europeans remained, for the most part, a blank canvas. However, the ink never dried completely. A few fascinating exceptions persisted, often driven by the very faith that sought to ban them. Christian pilgrims undertaking the long and perilous journey to the Holy Land would often return with a small, permanent souvenir, a tattoo of a cross on their hand or forearm. This was not seen as a pagan mark, but as an indelible badge of piety, proof that they had completed the sacred pilgrimage. Similarly, some crusaders who marched to fight in the Holy Land also embraced the needle. These knights and soldiers would have small crosses tattooed on their bodies for a grimly practical reason. They believed that if they were to fall in battle far from home, the tattoo would ensure their bodies were identified as Christian and afforded a proper burial, a form of spiritual insurance in a time of brutal conflict. So, while the official doctrine of the medieval church sought to wipe the art of tattooing from existence, it never quite succeeded. The practice survived in these small, devout pockets, hiding in plain sight on the arms of pilgrims and soldiers. The ink was dormant, a buried relic waiting patiently for a new age to bring it back to the surface. As the medieval period gave way to the age of exploration, and great wooden ships began to chart the unknown corners of the globe, tattoos found a new canvas, the skin of sailors. After centuries of lying dormant in Europe, the art of ink was about to be rediscovered and reborn, not in a church or a royal court, but on the high seas, carried by men whose lives were defined by salt, superstition, and adventure. The pivotal moment came in the late 18th century, during the legendary voyages of Captain James Cook. When his crew first made landfall in Polynesia, they encountered societies where tattooing was not a forgotten relic, but a vibrant and sacred part of everyday life. They were astounded by the intricate, full-body designs of the Tahitian and Mbori people, a level of artistry they had never imagined. Intrigued and deeply impressed, many of the sailors on Cook's voyages chose to get tattooed themselves. For them, it was the ultimate souvenir, an indelible mark that proved they had journeyed to the far side of the world and encountered its wonders. They returned to the ports of Europe not just with exotic spices and stories, but with the art of the islands written directly on their bodies. Suddenly, a tattoo became a kind of living resume. A sailor's ink told the story of his travels, a permanent record of the ports he'd visited and the oceans he'd crossed. A dragon might signify service in China, while a turtle meant he had crossed the equator. These marks instantly identified a man as a seasoned and worldly mariner, a survivor of the planet's most dangerous frontiers. Soon, tattoos became the unofficial uniform of the seafaring man. But this new wave of body art wasn't just for show. It was deeply rooted in the superstitions that governed life at sea. Sailors developed their own complex language of symbols, each one a charm meant to ward off bad luck and ensure a safe return home. A pig and a rooster, often tattooed on the feet, were believed to protect a sailor from drowning, as these animals were kept in wooden crates that often floated in the event of a shipwreck. An anchor on the forearm was a symbol of stability and the hope of one day returning to harbor for good. The words "Hold Fast" inked across the knuckles were a literal prayer for the strength to grip the ship's rigging during a violent storm. Religious icons also remained incredibly popular, facing the constant threat of death from tempests and disease. Many sailors tattooed crosses or images of the Virgin Mary onto their backs or chests. They saw these marks as a form of divine protection, an extra layer of spiritual armor to shield them when the merciless ocean turned against them. As these tattooed sailors filtered back into the port towns of Europe and America, they brought the practice with them. It spread not to the nobility, but to the working class and the outcasts, dock workers, soldiers, and convicts. The art of the tattoo had returned to the West, reborn as the gritty, personal language of the adventurer and the defiant. By the 19th and 20th centuries, tattoos had drifted far from their ancient, sacred origins. In the Western world, they had become firmly established on the fringes of society, the marks of sailors, soldiers, and circus performers. But it was behind prison walls that tattoos developed their most complex and secret language, a gritty code spoken in improvised ink and sharpened needles. Nowhere was this language more sophisticated than in the brutal prison camps of the Soviet Union. Within the Russian criminal underworld, tattoos were not decorative. They were a ruthlessly enforced biography. Every image, every symbol, held a specific meaning, creating a visual resume that detailed a prisoner's crimes, his rank in the criminal hierarchy, and his personal philosophy. To be able to read these tattoos was to understand a man's entire life story at a glance. The code was intricate and absolute. A cathedral etched onto the chest or back was a common motif, with the number of domes signifying the number of prison sentences served. Stars on the shoulders or knees marked a man as a high-ranking thief, a vor v zakon, who bowed to no authority, not even the prison guards. Barbed wire across the forehead meant a life sentence without the possibility of parole. This was a language with deadly consequences. To wear a symbol you hadn't earned was a cardinal sin, an act of deception that would be punished severely. The false tattoo might be forcibly scraped from the skin with a shard of glass or a sharpened spoon, or the wearer might simply be killed. In this world, your ink was your honor, and a lie could cost you your life. A similar, though aesthetically different, tradition flourished in Japan with the criminal syndicate known as the Yakuza. They took the art of irizumi, once used by the state as a form of punishment, and transformed it into the ultimate badge of loyalty. Full body suits of tattoos depicting mythical beasts, samurai warriors, and religious deities were hidden beneath expensive business suits, a secret identity known only to those within their world. For a Yakuza member, undergoing this extensive tattooing was a profound rite of passage. The process was excruciatingly painful, incredibly expensive, and could take years to complete. It was a permanent test of one's endurance and commitment to the clan, a declaration that one had left the world of ordinary citizens behind forever. In the prisons of the West, the codes were often simpler, but no less significant. A teardrop tattooed beneath the eye could signify that the wearer had committed a murder, or in some contexts, was mourning the loss of a loved one. A spider's web on the elbow often meant a long prison sentence, the idea being that the prisoner had sat still for so long that a spider had time to build a home. These marks were created with smuggled sewing needles, guitar strings, and ink made from burnt shoe rubber or melted pens. For many inmates, getting tattooed was a desperate act of self-ownership. In a system designed to strip away all personal identity, to take your name and give you a number, inking your skin was a way to reclaim your body. It was a defiant whisper in a world that demanded silence, a declaration that even in chains, a part of you remained untamed. By the time the 20th century rolled into full swing, the tattoo had journeyed from a sacred ritual to an outlaw's code. Now it was about to embark on its next great transformation, a slow, defiant crawl from the absolute fringes of society toward the mainstream. In the early 1900s, you could still find tattooed individuals showcased as curiosities in circus sideshows. Tattooed ladies and illustrated men would charge the public a small fee to gaze upon their fully inked skin, their bodies treated as a shocking and taboo spectacle. A subtle shift began to happen around the mid-century, largely driven by soldiers returning home from the Second World War. They brought with them simple, emblematic tattoos, an anchor, an eagle, a heart with the word "Mom" scrolled inside. These were not acts of rebellion, but deeply personal keepsakes burned into the skin, tangible reminders of the places they had been, the things they had seen, and the brothers they had lost in battle. Then came the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s, and the tattoo was adopted as the ultimate symbol of rebellion. It began breaking out of its blue-collar and military confines and onto the skin of a new generation of outsiders. Rock stars, bikers, and beat poets embraced ink as a clear and visible rejection of the clean-cut conformity of their parents' generation. Getting a tattoo became a powerful statement. It was a way of telling the world, "I do not care about your rules or your judgment." Rock legends like Janis Joplin had delicate tattoos on their wrists, while members of motorcycle clubs, like the Hells Angels, wore their ink like a badge of honor, a symbol of their fierce independence and loyalty to their own tribe. As demand grew, the tattoo parlor itself began to evolve. It slowly moved out of the shadowy, back-alley dens of port towns and into more legitimate, studio-like spaces. Artists like Lyle Tuttle became minor celebrities in their own right, famously tattooing rock stars like Cher and members of the Rolling Stones. They helped transform the public perception of the tattooist from a shady character to a genuine artist. But the stigma did not vanish overnight. Well into the 1990s and even the early 2000s, having visible tattoos could be a major barrier to employment. No visible tattoos was a common policy printed directly into job applications for corporate and service industry roles. The ink still whispered of criminality, recklessness, and a life lived outside the bounds of polite society, a prejudice that was often applied even more harshly to women. The tide, however, was irreversibly turning. The emergence of reality TV shows centered on tattoo shops, the growing number of mainstream celebrities embracing full sleeves, and the rise of massive tattoo conventions all helped to demystify and normalize the art form for a global audience. The tattoo was no longer a secret language. It was becoming a conversation. From a spectacle in a circus tent to a statement of rebellion on the arm of a rock star, the tattoo spent the 20th century fighting for its place. We hope you're enjoying this history. If you're finding it interesting, please show your support by subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes. In a world where our voices, our memories, and our identities increasingly live in the intangible realm of the digital cloud, you might think something as permanent and analog as a tattoo would be left behind. Instead, the opposite has happened. We are living in a global renaissance of ink, where the ancient art of tattooing is not just surviving the modern age, but evolving with it in fascinating ways. Technology has become an integral part of the process. Tattoo artists now use artificial intelligence to help generate hyper-detailed and complex designs that would have been impossible to draw by hand. The tattoo machine itself has become a marvel of precision engineering, capable of creating lines with surgical accuracy. The craft is blending ancient tradition with cutting-edge innovation. On the horizon, the fusion of technology and skin is poised to go even further. In laboratories around the world, scientists are already testing smart tattoos. These are not ink, but thin, flexible electronic patches that adhere to the skin, embedded with sensors capable of monitoring your heart rate, tracking your vitals, or even controlling your smart devices. The tattoo of the future might not just tell a story, it might save your life. Even without such futuristic tech, the tattoo has boomed. What was once taboo is now celebrated across countless cultures, professions, and age groups. Doctors have full sleeves hidden under their white coats. Teachers have small, meaningful symbols on their wrists. And CEOs walk into boardrooms with intricate back pieces concealed by their suits. The old stereotypes are finally dissolving. Social media has played a massive role in this shift, democratizing the art form on a global scale. An artist in a small studio in Seoul can become an international sensation overnight. A customer in Seattle can discover and book a session with their dream artist in Berlin with just a few taps on a phone. The world of ink is now more connected and accessible than ever before. With this accessibility has come a new wave of hyper-personalization. Tattoos today are often deeply intimate, functioning as a kind of permanent scrapbook on the skin. People get tattoos of the sound wave from a loved one's laugh, the geographic coordinates of where they fell in love, photorealistic portraits of their pets, or the star constellation from the night their child was born. At the same time, there is a powerful movement to reconnect with the art's most ancient roots. Indigenous communities, from the Arctic to the Andes, are reviving their ancestral tattooing practices. Designs and rituals that were suppressed by centuries of colonialism are being proudly reclaimed by a new generation, turning the skin into a canvas of cultural remembrance and resilience. The tattoo has always lived in the fascinating space between pain and beauty, permanence and transformation. It is both primal and futuristic, a whisper from our most ancient ancestors and a bold declaration for tomorrow. And as long as human beings continue to crave meaning, to cherish memory, and to mark the stories of their lives, the ink will endure. Before empires rose and fell in stone and sand, and long before kings learned to tremble at her name, Tomyris was a daughter of the wind. She was born to the raw, open steppe, a vast and unforgiving land that did not build monuments of marble, but instead forged souls of iron. This was the world of the Massagetæ, a fierce nation of nomadic horse archers who rode like spirits across the endless plains. There lives a testament to freedom, honor, and war. We know very little of Tomyris's childhood, but we can imagine its rhythm. It would have been a life lived on horseback, a life where one learned to shoot a bow before they could speak in full sentences, and to navigate by the stars before they could read a map. Among the Massagetæ girls were not veiled and hidden in tents. They trained beside the boys, rode with the warriors, and learned that leadership was earned not through bloodlines alone, but through strength and courage. To lead her people, one had to understand them. The Massagetæ worshipped the sun as their only god, lived from the milk and meat of their vast herds, and buried their dead with their weapons in hand, ready for the battles of the afterlife. They had no cities to conquer, no golden temples to plunder. All they had was their freedom and their pride, and they would defend both to the death. Tomyris most likely rose to power after the death of her husband, who was the king of their tribe. But in a world dominated by men, she did not simply inherit his title, she seized it. At a time when women in most great civilizations were considered little more than property, Tomyris commanded an army of formidable warriors. She dared to speak to kings as an equal, a true warrior queen. She was a Shabanu, a term for a ruling queen, but she was more than that. She was a war chief, a strategist, and the living embodiment of her people's untamed spirit. Clad in bronze and leather, she was the master of the steppe, a queen who would soon be forced to defend her world against the greatest empire on earth. For as Tomyris was solidifying her rule over the northern grasslands, a shadow was growing in the south. A different kind of power, centralized, imperial, and relentless, was expanding its borders. Its ruler was a man whose ambition knew no bounds, a king who had already conquered kingdoms and built an empire that stretched across the known world. His name was Cyrus the Great. Cyrus, the king of Persia, had built his empire on conquest, and now his gaze turned northward toward the lands of the Massagetæ. He saw not a people to be respected, but a territory to be absorbed, and a final frontier to be tamed. The stage was now set for one of history's most epic confrontations. The free people of the steppe and their warrior queen were about to be tested by the most powerful man of the age. The steppe wind howled, and Tomyris, daughter of warriors, would soon ride into legend. while Tomyris ruled the open steppes. A very different kind of power was consolidating in the south. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire of Persia, had already forged a domain of unprecedented scale. His armies had conquered the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in the west and the ancient, magnificent city of Babylon in the south. His banners flew over dozens of nations, a testament to his military genius and political skill. But for a builder of empires, the horizon always beckons. To Cyrus, the Massagetæ were both a threat and an opportunity. They possessed no great cities of gold, but they controlled the vast, untamed lands of his northeastern frontier. Subduing them would secure vital trade routes and remove a proud, independent people who could challenge his authority. In the eyes of an emperor, an unconquered neighbor is always a problem waiting to happen. But Cyrus was known for his cunning as much as for his military might. He understood that brute force was not always the most efficient path to victory. He often preferred to use diplomacy, strategy, and even trickery to achieve his goals. So, his first move against the warrior queen of the steppes was not with a sword, but with a proposition. According to the ancient historian Herodotus, Cyrus sent a delegation of envoys to the camp of Tomyris. They carried with them a royal offer of an alliance, to be sealed through a marriage between the two rulers. On the surface, it was a proposal between equals, the great king of Persia and the powerful queen of the Massagetæ. But Tomyris was no fool. She had spent her life navigating the harsh politics of tribal warlords and understood power in its rawest forms. She saw the marriage proposal not as an offer of partnership, but as a thinly veiled political maneuver, a clever attempt to absorb her people and her lands into the Persian Empire without spilling a single drop of blood. She recognized the cage, even though it was gilded, and she refused. Her rejection was a deep insult to the pride of Cyrus the Great. The diplomatic games were over. If he could not take her kingdom with a wedding ring, he would take it with an army. He gave the order to his forces to march north to the Araxes River, the natural border that separated the Persian Empire from the endless grasslands of the Massagetæ. This was the point of no return. Cyrus's engineers began constructing a bridge of boats to ferry his massive army across the river. A clear and irreversible act of invasion. The greatest military machine of the age was now set in motion, aimed squarely at the heart of the steppe. Tomyris, however, was already preparing for war. She knew her land. She knew how her people fought on horseback, like a fast and furious storm. And above all, she knew that Cyrus was not just coming for territory. He was coming to crush the woman who had dared to defy him. The world's most powerful king had just declared war, but he had no idea what kind of fury he was about to awaken. Cyrus the Great, the seasoned conqueror and master strategist, did not believe in fighting on his enemy's terms. He had faced down the armies of kings and crushed entire nations. To him, the Massagetæ were little more than undisciplined nomads, their queen a novelty to be swept aside. He underestimated her, and in doing so, he sealed his own fate. Having crossed the river into her lands, Cyrus ignored Tomyris's final warning to retreat. Instead of seeking a direct, honorable battle, he decided to rely on cunning. He ordered a portion of his army to set up a lavish camp and then stage a fake retreat, leaving it behind as bait. The camp was intentionally well stocked with fine foods and, most importantly, huge quantities of strong, undiluted wine. A luxury the Massagetæ rarely encountered, and did not know how to consume with moderation. The trap worked perfectly. A contingent of the Massagetsi army, led by Tomyris's own son, Spargapises, soon discovered the abandoned camp. Believing the famously mighty Persians had fled in fear, they fell upon the spoils with joyous celebration. They feasted on the rich food and drank deeply from the skins of wine, quickly falling into a drunken, helpless stupor. Under the cover of darkness, Cyrus and his main force returned. The attack was not a battle, it was a massacre. The Persians swarmed the camp, slaughtering the incapacitated Massagetate warriors as they slept. The victory was swift, brutal, and utterly without honor. In the aftermath of the slaughter, Spargapises, the son of Queen Tomyris, was captured and brought before Cyrus as a prisoner. When the young prince finally sobered up and understood the full horror of what had happened, that his foolishness had led to the destruction of his men, he was overcome with shame. According to the histories, he begged Cyrus to release him from his bonds, and as soon as his hands were free, he took his own life rather than live as a captive. When word of this reached Queen Tomyris, something inside her broke. The initial shock of her son's capture gave way to the devastating news of his death. Her immense grief, the sorrow of a mother for her lost child, did not crush her. Instead, it was forged into a cold and terrible weapon. The queen vanished, and in her place stood an avenger. She sent one final message to the Persian king. It was not a warning or a negotiation. It was a vow. "You are a glutton for blood, Cyrus," the message read, a promise of what was to come. "You took my son from me by treachery. Now I swear, by the son who is the master of the Massagetsi, that I will give you your fill of blood." Cyrus had taken her son. He had violated her land with deceit. Now he would not face a queen defending her throne. He would face the wrath of a grieving mother, and she would make the very ground run red with the blood of his empire. The sun rose over the vast plains like a freshly sharpened blade, casting long shadows across the assembled army of the Massagetsi. At their head sat Tomyris, no longer just a queen, but a storm of grief and vengeance given human form. Her warriors, their faces painted with ash and their hearts filled with rage, were silent. This was not a battle for land or for glory. This was an execution. Cyrus the Great, for all his imperial might, had made a fatal error. He assumed the Massagetsi would fight like other nomadic tribes he had conquered, with wild, uncoordinated charges that could be easily broken by his disciplined Persian infantry. He was not prepared for the focused, strategic fury that Tomyris was about to unleash upon him. She did not wait for the Persians to advance. She launched a ferocious, all-out assault, a tidal wave of horse archers sweeping across the grasslands. They moved like a single, deadly organism, firing devastating volleys of arrows from horseback before closing the distance with axes and short swords. They fought with the desperation of a people defending their very existence and the rage of an army avenging their slain prince. Tomyris did not command her army from the safety of the rear. She rode at the very front of the charge, her presence a blazing torch of inspiration for her warriors. Her every strike was an answer to her son's death, every command fueled by her vow of vengeance. The battlefield became a whirlwind of dust and steel, as the disciplined Persian lines buckled under the sheer ferocity of the attack. The Persian army, the most feared military force of its time, shattered. The battle-hardened soldiers who had conquered half the known world were routed, their formations broken, their courage extinguished. They died where they stood or fled in terror into the endless plains, only to be hunted down by the swift Massagetæ cavalry. And in the heart of the chaos, Cyrus the Great, the king of kings, the ruler of the Persian Empire, fell. Whether he was slain by an anonymous arrow or cut down in the desperate melee, the outcome was the same. The man who had believed himself invincible died on Tomyris's land, on her terms. What followed has become one of the most chilling and iconic moments in ancient history. According to Herodotus, Tomyris walked the blood-soaked battlefield until she found the body of her fallen enemy. She ordered his head to be severed from his body. Then, in the ultimate act of symbolic revenge, she took the head and plunged it into a wineskin she had filled with the blood of slain Persian soldiers. Holding the head submerged in the gore, she fulfilled her terrible vow with words that would echo through the ages. "Though I have conquered you and live," she said, "you have destroyed me by taking my son. Now, as I promised, I give you your fill of blood." The Queen of the Steppes had been served, her vengeance, cold and absolute. When the dust of the battle finally settled and the grass of the steppe had drunk its fill of Persian blood, Queen Tomyris stood victorious. She had done what no king, no army, and no nation had managed to do before. She had brought Cyrus the Great, the conqueror of the known world, to his end. Her vow was fulfilled, and her vengeance was complete. News of the catastrophic defeat sent shockwaves across the ancient world. The mighty Achaemenid Empire, thought to be an unstoppable force, had been dealt a devastating and humiliating blow by a nomadic queen from beyond its borders. Persian historians did their best to downplay the disaster, but the death of their empire's founder was a stain on their legacy that could not be easily washed away. Eventually, the body of Cyrus was returned to his people and buried with all the honors befitting a king in the grand tomb he had built for himself at Pasargadae. Yet, the story of his final brutal campaign would forever haunt his legacy, a permanent reminder that even the greatest of empires could be humbled. For Tomyris and the Massagetæ, however, the victory was far more than just revenge. It was a thunderous declaration of their sovereignty. They had faced the most powerful military machine on the planet, and had not just survived, they had triumphed. They had defended their freedom, not just with arrows and axes, but with an unbreakable will. The steppe would remain unconquered. And then, after this monumental achievement, Queen Tomyris seems to simply vanish from the pages of history. There are no surviving records that detail her later years, the circumstances of her death, or who she may have appointed as her successor. It is as if, having secured her people's freedom and avenged her son, she rode back into the vast horizon of the steppe and allowed the wind to erase her tracks. This very silence is what allowed her to become a legend. With the facts of her later life unknown, she was transformed from a historical figure into a powerful symbol. Chroniclers, poets, and artists in the centuries that followed were free to interpret her story, turning her into a figure that reflected their own values and fears. To the Persians, her name was a bitter reminder of imperial arrogance and its consequences. To the Greeks, who were rivals of the Persians, she was a fascinating paradox, a barbarian queen who displayed more courage and noble fury than many of their own civilized rulers. And to the many peoples of Central Asia, she became a foundational figure of folklore, a fierce and unbending mother of their nations. Her story became a ghost story, a tale of a warrior queen who still rides the plains, her sword forever remembering the taste of an emperor's blood. Her legacy was not carved into stone monuments that could crumble and fade. it was carried on the wind, making it eternal. Most of what we know about Queen Tomyris comes to us not from the records of her own people. The nomadic Massagetee left no written histories or royal archives, but from the pen of a single Greek man. The historian Herodotus, often called the father of history, immortalized Tomyris in his great work, the Histories, writing about her nearly a century after she lived. It is through his eyes that her story has survived the millennia. But Herodotus was not just a reporter of dry facts. He was a master storyteller. He wove together historical accounts, eyewitness reports, and local legends to create sweeping narratives that were as much about teaching moral lessons as they were about recording the past. His work reads less like a textbook and more like an epic. To Herodotus and his Greek audience, the story of Tomyris was the ultimate morality tale. It was a dramatic illustration of imperial hubris meeting its downfall. The great Cyrus, a figure of immense power who had conquered many nations, was brought low not by a rival emperor or a grand army, but by a so-called barbarian queen from the wild frontiers. This powerful reversal of fortune would have been a deeply satisfying story for the Greeks, who lived under the constant shadow of the Persian Empire. This narrative framing, however, leads modern historians to ask a crucial question: how much of the story is true? Many scholars argue that Herodotus likely exaggerated or even invented some of the most sensational details. The climactic scene with the wineskin full of blood, for instance, may have been a powerful symbolic invention designed to deliver his moral point about a man who thirsted for blood getting his fill. Others believe that while some elements might be embellished for dramatic effect, the core of the story is likely factual. It is historically plausible that Cyrus the Great did indeed meet his end during a disastrous campaign against the powerful tribes of the steppe, and that a formidable queen named Tomyris was the leader who defeated him. The story is one of humiliation, which may explain why official Persian records of the event are so sparse. We must also consider the filter of cultural bias. Herodotus, for all his curiosity, was a Greek man writing for a Greek audience. He often portrayed foreign cultures through a specific lens, casting the Massagetee as wild and free, yet possessing a noble savagery that mirrored Greek ideals of honor. In his telling, Tomyris becomes not just a historical figure, but a moral counterweight to Persian tyranny. But regardless of the historical accuracy of every detail, Herodotus accomplished something extraordinary. He ensured that the name of Tomyris would not be lost to the winds of the steppe. Because of his powerful storytelling, she was elevated from a regional queen to a figure of legend, her name forever etched into the memory of the world. Her story now exists in that fascinating gray area between myth and memory. The exact facts may be blurry, but the impact of her legend is crystal clear. Herodotus gave us an unforgettable queen who refused to kneel and left an empire mourning at her feet. Though she may have slain one of the ancient world's most famous emperors, Queen Tomyris never ruled an empire herself. She built no cities of stone, wrote no laws on clay tablets, and minted no coins bearing her likeness. Her people, the Massagetee, were nomads. Their kingdom was not a place on a map defined by walls, but a way of life defined by the rhythms of the land, the sky, and the horse. The Massagetee were one of many powerful tribal confederations that roamed the vast Eurasian steppe. They were part of a larger family of cultures, including the famous Scythians and the Saga, who shared a common lifestyle as master horse archers. For centuries, these tribes dominated the immense grasslands that stretched from the borders of Europe to the frontiers of ancient China. To the great settled empires of the world, these nomadic peoples were a source of constant fear and fascination. They were famously mobile, able to appear and disappear like ghosts across the plains. Their skill in warfare, particularly their ability to shoot arrows with deadly accuracy from horseback, made them a formidable and unpredictable threat on the fringes of civilization. Crucially, these steppe cultures differed from many sedentary societies in one profound way: the role of women. In a nomadic lifestyle where everyone had to contribute to survival, women were afforded far greater freedoms and authority. They were not confined to the home. They rode, they hunted, they managed tribal logistics, and in many cases, they fought. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed that the Greek legends of the Amazons were likely inspired by these real-life warrior women of the steppe. Across the region, burial mounds, known as kurgans, have been excavated to reveal the graves of high-status women buried with full sets of weapons: bows, arrows, swords, and daggers. These were not ceremonial objects. These were the tools of women who were warriors and leaders in their own right. Tomyris stands as the ultimate embodiment of this tradition. Her power was not an accident of birth. It was a reflection of her proven capability. She was a respected political leader who could unify scattered clans, and a brilliant military commander who could lead them in battle. In a society that valued strength and skill above all else, she earned her right to rule. Because the Massagetæ left no grand monuments behind, Tomyris became a kind of phantom queen. Her story survives almost exclusively in the writings of outsiders, like the Greeks, who were fascinated by her, and the Persians, who were defeated by her. In the historical record, her name echoes not from her own archives, but from those of her enemies and admirers. Empires may rise and crumble in stone, but the stories of the steppe are carried on the wind and in the bloodlines of their descendants. Tomyris, the grieving mother and unbroken warrior, became the voice of that untamable spirit, a queen whose throne was a saddle and whose crown was the open sky. Centuries passed. The great empires that had once surrounded the lands of the Massagetæ rose to magnificent heights and then crumbled into dust. The successors of Cyrus the Great built the grand city of Persepolis, fought epic wars against the Greeks, and were eventually conquered by Alexander the Great, their dynasty fading into the footnotes of time. But the legend of Tomyris endured, not in the palaces of kings, but in the stories of those who refused to bow. Across Central Asia, she evolved from a historical queen into a figure of folklore, a symbol of the untamed spirit of the steppe. Because her story belonged to no single empire, it was free to be adopted and retold by many different cultures. In the medieval Islamic world, chroniclers would occasionally recount her tale, sometimes praising her for her fierce sense of justice, and at other times portraying her as a savage queen, a cautionary tale about the terrifying power a woman could wield. It was during the Renaissance in Europe that her story was fully reborn. As the classical texts of Greek historians like Herodotus were rediscovered and translated, a new generation of artists and thinkers became captivated by the tale of the Scythian queen. They saw in her a figure of immense strength, classical virtue, and righteous defiance. Tomyris became a popular subject for Renaissance and Baroque painters. Artists like Peter Paul Rubens created dramatic theatrical paintings, depicting her most famous moment. They imagined her in elaborate, flowing gowns and fantastical armor, standing triumphantly over the lifeless body of Cyrus, his severed head held aloft like a grim trophy. These paintings were not just historical recreations. They were political and philosophical statements. The artists of the time were fascinated by the idea of a woman who did not just survive in a world dominated by men, but who conquered it on her own terms. Tomyris became a powerful symbol of justified vengeance, the righteous underdog, and the formidable power of a woman wronged. In the 19th and 20th centuries, her legend took another turn. As the nations of Central Asia began to forge their modern identities, Tomyris was reclaimed as a national heroine. In countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, she was celebrated in poetry and textbooks as a mother of their nations, a direct link to a proud, pre-Islamic, and fiercely independent past. Today, her image is woven into the fabric of modern Central Asian culture. Statues of her rise in capital cities. Her face adorns national currency, and her name is invoked in military ceremonies. The woman who once ruled on horseback with a bow in her hand now rides again through the collective memory and national pride of millions. She remains a challenging and complex figure. She was not a gentle or saintly queen. She was decisive, brutal when necessary, and driven by a grief that she turned into a weapon. Her legacy is one of unapologetic resistance, a queen who wore the blood of a fallen empire as a crown and who never asked for forgiveness. History tends to favor the builders. It remembers the kings who construct great monuments, the emperors who write sweeping legal codes, and the rulers who carve their names into stone for all eternity. Queen Tomyris did none of these things. She left no grand palace to be excavated, no royal seal to be deciphered, and no empire to carry her name into the future. And yet, her name endures. It has survived not because of what she built, but because of what she refused to see broken. She did not defend an empire of gold and stone. She defended an empire of the spirit, a freedom that was carried on the backs of horses, that slept under the stars, and that could never be contained by walls or borders. Her story stands as a powerful contradiction to how history so often remembers women. She was not a footnote in a great man's story, nor was she a passive queen who ruled from the safety of a throne room. Tomyris was an active, driving force of destiny, the hero of her own epic tale. She did not wait for history to happen to her. She rode out to meet it. She did not beg for recognition from the great powers of her time. She took it with blood and fire. She did not ride behind a king. She rode against one, and she won. This is why her story continues to be retold in classrooms and celebrated by nations. Not simply because she killed Cyrus the Great, but because she dared to defy him when no one else could. In a world still grappling with questions of power, justice, and defiance, her legend remains profoundly relevant. She is a timeless symbol of resistance against a seemingly unbeatable force. Her struggle was not for abstract power, but for something far more elemental and human. She was a mother avenging her son, a leader protecting her people, a queen defending her home. We often wonder why some names survive the great forgetting of time, while countless others vanish. Tomyris survived because her story is simply unforgettable. In a world of cautious kings and political maneuvering, she was a force of nature, a queen whose grief became a weapon, and whose courage brought an empire to its knees. Empires fall, statues crumble into dust, but legends ride forever. And somewhere, in the whispering winds that sweep across the endless plains of the steppe, the warrior queen still gallops, unbroken, undefeated, and utterly, eternally unforgettable.